Stretching across thousands of nautical miles, the Eastern Pacific Ocean represents one of the most trafficked, yet least surveilled, maritime zones exploited by organized crime in the Western Hemisphere. Its sheer size, coupled with a lack of consistent maritime enforcement presence, makes it an attractive and effective corridor for illicit maritime activity. Over the past 2 decades, drug trafficking organizations, DTOs operating out of South and Central America, have increasingly turned to these waters to move vast quantities of cocaine, methamphetamines, and synthetic opioids northward toward Mexico, the United States, and beyond to Canada and Europe. Unlike traditional land-based trafficking, maritime smuggling allows DTOs to avoid border checkpoints, radar surveillance nets, and ground-based interdiction units. Using small, high-speed fiberglass boats known as go-fast designed to skim the water, undetected traffickers can transport multi-ton payloads under the radar, literally and figuratively. These vessels have minimal radar signatures, can travel hundreds of miles at high speed, and are often crewed by experienced smugglers trained to destroy evidence and evade capture at sea. In many cases, they sail without national markings, flag state registration, or radio transponders, placing them legally in the category of stateless vessels and subject to international boarding and seizure protocols. In response to this growing maritime threat, the United States has established a layered defense framework called Pacific Watch, a joint operational initiative designed to extend U.S. maritime reach far beyond its shores. Under the leadership of U.S. Northern Command, USN or THCOM, and in partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard, Pacific Watch integrates the Navy's strategic assets with the Coast Guard's domestic law enforcement authority. This alignment enables destroyers, cruisers, and other warships to operate not only as warfighting platforms, but also as mobile law enforcement staging areas. U.S. Navy ships provide long-range radar, aviation capabilities, and command infrastructure, while embarked Coast Guard law enforcement detachments, leadettes, bring the legal power to stop, search, arrest, and seize vessels in accordance with federal and international law. On July 10, 2025, this layered approach was put to the test when the USS Sampson, DDG-102, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer assigned to Pacific Watch, detected and intercepted a stateless vessel deep in the Eastern Pacific. Initially flagged during a routine surface scan, the contact quickly escalated into a full-scale interdiction operation involving airborne pursuit, rules of engagement escalation, boarding by joint Navy Coast Guard teams, narcotics recovery, and the lawful disposal of an unseaworthy smuggling craft. The suspect vessel, later confirmed to be carrying over 1.5 metric tons of cocaine, with a wholesale value exceeding $58 million, was intercepted more than 380 nautical miles from the nearest coastline. The entire engagement from detection to final scuttling took place in international waters, underscoring both the jurisdictional reach and tactical efficiency of U.S. maritime enforcement efforts when coordinated through the Pacific Watch framework. This report provides a detailed timeline and operational breakdown of the July 10 mission. It offers a case study in 21st-century maritime interdiction, where precision targeting, legal authority, and interagency cooperation converge to confront transnational crime at sea. The success of this operation, conducted without hostile fire or injury to U.S. personnel or suspects, demonstrates how the U.S. can leverage its maritime presence not only to project power, but to enforce law, disrupt smuggling networks, and safeguard the global commons. At precisely 637 hours on the morning of July 10, 2025, radar operators aboard the USS Sampson, DDG-102, detected an anomalous surface contact while conducting a standard radar sweep in the open waters of the Eastern Pacific. The contact appeared approximately 380 nautical miles southwest of Acapulco, Mexico, outside national territorial waters, but squarely within a maritime zone historically exploited by transnational drug trafficking organizations. The radar return was immediately notable for its low radar cross-section and inconsistent return signature, consistent with a small, fast-moving vessel traveling at high speed. Rather than reflecting the steady, predictable signature of a commercial craft or civilian pleasure boat, the contact displayed erratic blips, sudden course alterations, and high-velocity hallmarks of a go-fast boat. These vessels are purpose-built for smuggling operations, lightweight, unregistered, and capable of carrying thousands of pounds of illicit cargo across long stretches of open ocean. Go-fast boats are engineered for stealth and endurance. Typically constructed of reinforced fiberglass or Kevlar, their shallow draft and flat profile reduce radar detectability. Multiple outboard motors provide both speed and redundancy, enabling these craft to maintain high rates of travel, often in excess of 35 to 40 knots when heavily loaded. Their design also allows for abrupt maneuvering and low visibility from aerial surveillance platforms. When viewed on radar, especially in sea clutter, they appear and disappear quickly, unless actively tracked by a skilled operator. The Combat Information Center, CIC, aboard the Samson rapidly shifted attention to the contact. Radar tracking technicians calculated the vessel's bearing, velocity, and track history. The pattern of movement nonlinear course changes, acceleration-deceleration loops, and a westward sprint away from land raised immediate suspicion. Within less than 30 seconds, the CIC elevated the contact to a high-threat priority and alerted the officer of the deck, OOD, and commanding officer. The Samson surveillance team then activated the ship's forward-looking infrared FLIR system, which provided real-time thermal imaging of the target. The feed revealed a small open-deck craft with 2 individuals aboard. One appeared to be at the helm, while the second moved quickly along the stern, throwing square-shaped packages overboard in rapid succession. These bales, rectangular and tightly wrapped, matched the visual profile of compressed cocaine bricks historically recovered during similar interdictions. This act jettisoning cargo while underway is a well-documented method used by DTOs to avoid direct criminal prosecution. By discarding narcotics before authorities make contact, smugglers hope to weaken the legal chain of possession and reduce potential sentencing if captured. However, when observed in real time, this behavior strengthens the basis for probable cause under U.S. maritime drug enforcement law. The vessel provided no identifying information. It did not fly a national flag, had no painted registration markings, and did not emit an AIS, automatic identification system signal. Multiple attempts to hail the vessel over marine VHF radio channels went unanswered. The silence, combined with evasive routing and cargo dumping, met the international legal criteria for classification as a stateless vessel. Under Article 110 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, stateless vessels suspected of illicit activity in international waters may be boarded, inspected, and, if warranted, seized by any competent authority. In this instance, the United States, through the legal provisions of the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act, MDLEA, possessed full jurisdiction to interdict and take enforcement action against the vessel and its crew. Commander Matthew Harding, the commanding officer of USS Samson, reviewed the intelligence provided by the CIC, FLIR feed, and ship's legal officer. Based on the totality of indicators, evasive maneuvers, active evidence disposal, refusal to communicate, and the vessel's lack of nationality, he directed the ship to escalate to interdiction posture. The ship's boarding teams were placed on standby. The flight deck initiated pre-launch for aerial support. A real-time legal notification was transmitted to U.S. Coast Guard District 11 and Pacific Watch Command to initiate law enforcement synchronization. The situation had moved rapidly from routine patrol to active maritime interdiction. The next steps would involve deploying rotary wing aviation assets, coordinating rules of engagement, and preparing for evidence recovery under chain of custody protocol while executing high-speed pursuit in international waters against a target attempting to vanish into the open sea. With visual and infrared confirmation of a stateless vessel actively discarding suspected narcotics and refusing to respond to lawful maritime hails, the USS Samson immediately elevated its operational posture. Commander Matthew Harding declared Condition 3 readiness and elevated alert status, requiring all critical shipboard systems, including aviation assets, weapons control, and boarding teams, to prepare for rapid deployment. The ship's crew transitioned from routine patrol mode to full intercept configuration within minutes. Inside the Combat Information Center, CIC, a real-time communication feed was established with both Pacific Watch Command and U.S. Coast Guard District 11 headquartered in Alameda, California. This coordination was more than procedural, it was essential. While the U.S. Navy maintains the capability to detect, pursue, and, if necessary, disable non-compliant vessels in international waters, it does not hold independent legal authority to make arrests or seize evidence under peacetime maritime law. Those powers rest exclusively with the U.S. Coast Guard, operating under Title 14 of the U.S. Code. As such, any boarding, detention, or seizure effort must include Coast Guard presence and oversight to comply with U.S. legal and international norms. At 639 hours, just 2 minutes after the initial radar acquisition, the Samson's flight deck executed a launch of its embarked MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, assigned to Helicopter Maritime Strike Squadron 49, HSM-49, and operating under the tactical call sign Reaper 1. The launch was swift and precise, the result of prior deck drills and standard integration between ship and aviation personnel. Reaper 1 was outfitted for maritime interdiction. Its onboard equipment suite included advanced surface search radar for long-range detection, forward-looking infrared, FLIR, sensors for thermal tracking, and stabilized optical targeting pods for continuous lock-on under high-speed maneuvering. Encrypted tactical data links ensured that everything observed from the Air Course changes, cargo disposal, and crew behavior could be relayed live to CIC personnel aboard Samson, as well as to U.S. Coast Guard legal teams monitoring remotely. Equally important to the aircrew were its passengers. A law enforcement detachment, led at 104, from the U.S. Coast Guard, embedded aboard Samson as part of the Joint Pacific Watch framework. These personnel are trained for at-sea arrests, evidence preservation, and the application of maritime drug enforcement law in real time. Their presence gave the forthcoming interdiction its legal foundation. 2 qualified Navy door gunners were also on board, each manning an M240B 7.62 mm machine gun, authorized under non-lethal rules of engagement, ROE protocols. Their role was to issue warning fire, suppress hostile actions if necessary, and if legally authorized, disable the propulsion system of the suspect craft without harming its crew. This tightly coordinated launch of Reaper 1 showcased the hybrid strength of Pacific Watch. Military aviation, speed, and surveillance capability fused with embedded law enforcement authority. As the Seahawk accelerated southeast toward the suspect vessel, flying low and fast to maintain sensor lock, the Samson's RHIB, rigid hold inflatable boat teams, and visit board search and seizure VBSS crew remained staged on deck. They would be the next to move once the aerial platform established visual dominance and secured the scene for boarding. The operation was now fully underway in integrated, legally bound pursuit mission, spanning air, sea, and jurisdictional command. Within moments, U.S. maritime forces would be directly overhead, and the suspect vessel's attempt to vanish into open ocean would come to an end. Flying low over the rolling Pacific swells, Reaper 1, the MH-60R Seahawk helicopter launched from USS Samson, closed in rapidly on the radar-designated contact. The aircrew maintained a steady altitude of approximately 200 feet above sea level and an airspeed of 120 knots at tactical flight profile, specifically designed to optimize both sensor fidelity and visual range while reducing the chance of early detection by the target vessel. At this low altitude, the helicopter was able to hug the curvature of the sea, minimizing its radar and audio signature while preserving uninterrupted line-of-sight tracking. As Reaper 1 made visual contact, the Go Fast Boat's operators appeared to recognize the pursuing aircraft. What followed was an immediate shift in behavior. The suspect vessel accelerated abruptly, veering hard to port and then starboard in erratic succession. These maneuvers were neither navigational nor accidental, they were deliberate. This evasive behavior, widely recognized in maritime interdiction doctrine as zigzag evasion, is a defensive tactic used by narcotics traffickers to break sensor locks, confuse infrared tracking, and prolong pursuit long enough to either jettison contraband or escape into cluttered sea traffic. However, Reaper 1 surveillance systems were specifically designed to counter such tactics. Utilizing forward-looking infrared, FLIR, and stabilized electro-optical tracking pods, the crew was able to maintain continuous thermal and visual acquisition of the fleeing craft. Despite the sharp turns and irregular throttle patterns, the Seahawk systems held a firm lock. The FLIR feed clearly depicted 2 individuals aboard the open-deck vessel, one operating the helm, the other hastily discarding packaged materials over the side and into the sea. The bales were uniform in size and shape, rectangular, tightly wrapped, and non-buoyant, matching the known packaging format of compressed cocaine bricks. The infrared signature of the ejected materials briefly illuminated before vanishing beneath the surface, a visual confirmation that contraband was being actively destroyed. Multiple hailing attempts were initiated by Reaper 1 via standard maritime VHF radio frequencies, accompanied by overhead passes and visual cues. Despite these efforts, the vessel remained non-responsive. It did not reduce speed, alter course, acknowledge commands, or offer any signal of compliance. There was no visible flag, no hull identification markings, and no AIS, automatic identification system. Emissions further substantiating the classification of the craft as stateless under international maritime law. This continued pattern of non-compliance evasive maneuvers, active dumping of suspected narcotics, and refusal to acknowledge repeated warnings escalated the engagement from surveillance to enforcement. The helicopter crew relayed full situational data to the USS Samson's Combat Information Center, including live FLIR imagery, GPS location, behavioral analysis, and probable contraband evidence. Based on the totality of observed indicators, Reaper 1 requested rules of engagement, ROE, clearance for escalation of forces, specifically authorization to execute non-lethal deterrent measures against the suspect vessel. The request was received by Samson's commanding officer, Commander Matthew Harding, who conferred with his operations and legal officers aboard the bridge. With all legal and tactical criteria met, the next phase of the operation warning and disabling fire was about to begin. By 647 hours, with all attempts at communication ignored, and the vessel's operators still actively jettisoning suspected narcotics while executing evasive maneuvers, Commander Matthew Harding determined that the situation met the threshold for escalation under the U.S. Navy's non-lethal engagement protocols. These protocols, developed jointly with the U.S. Coast Guard, provide a graduated response framework in accordance with international maritime law, the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act, MDLEA, and Standing Rules of Engagement, ROE, for counter-narcotics operations. The first authorized measure was the deployment of warning shots, intended as a clear, final attempt to compel voluntary compliance before more assertive tactics were used. Reaper 1's port-side gunner, operating a 7.62mm MEM 240B medium machine gun, delivered a controlled burst aimed deliberately 10 meters off the starboard bow of the suspect vessel. The intent was not to damage or disable, but to send an unmistakable visual and auditory signal that the vessel was under lawful interdiction by U.S. forces and must stop immediately. The reaction from the suspect craft was unequivocal: non-compliance. The go-fast boat not only failed to halt, but continued to surge forward, alternating throttle speeds and throwing additional square-wrapped bales overboard in a last-ditch effort to destroy physical evidence. The evasive behavior showed no indication of de-escalation. With the suspect vessel displaying willful defiance, and with contraband actively being lost to the sea, Commander Harding authorized the next level of force. His command: disabling fire aim for propulsion. Reaper 1 immediately repositioned into a trailing pursuit arc, closing the distance to ensure maximum accuracy and minimize unintended damage. From an aft angle, the starboard gunner acquired a clean shot on the dual outboard engines. At 649 hours, a short, precisely aimed burst was fired. The rounds penetrated the exposed casings of both engines. Within seconds, the high-pitched whine of the motors faded into silence, and the suspect vessel began to lose forward momentum, listing slightly as it succumbed to the swells. The disabling action was both effective and controlled. No shots were fired at the hull or crew compartment. Post-engagement imagery confirmed that the vessel remained structurally intact. No individuals on board were harmed. The crew's movements appeared slowed but uninjured, and the deck activity ceased altogether. Now adrift and without power, the vessel was fully contained, no longer posing a flight risk or threat to U.S. assets. Reaper 1 entered an Overwatch holding pattern, maintaining persistent surveillance from above. With the suspect craft immobilized and its status stabilized, Commander Harding gave the signal to initiate the next phase of the mission. Visit, board, search, and seizure, VBSS, under the legal authority of the embarked U.S. Coast Guard Law Enforcement Detachment, Ledet 104. At 654 hours, with the suspect vessel disabled and adrift, the USS Sampson initiated the boarding phase of the operation. 2 RHIBs, rigid-hulled inflatable boats, were launched from the destroyer's port side. Each vessel carried a mixed team composed of U.S. Navy visit, board, search, and seizure, VBSS personnel, and members of U.S. Coast Guard Law Enforcement Detachment 104, Ledet 104. These teams had trained together extensively and were fully qualified in maritime interdiction, evidence handling, and tactical boarding procedures in international waters. The RHIBs moved swiftly across the sea, closing the remaining distance between Sampson and the now adrift go-fast vessel. Despite its disabled state, the craft still posed potential hazards ranging from hidden weapons to booby-trapped compartments, so the approach was executed with caution and tactical precision. Weapons were held in low-ready position visible but not pointed, underscoring the seriousness of the engagement while allowing room for voluntary compliance. Upon arrival, boarding officers issued loud, clear verbal commands in both English and Spanish. Manos arriba, and hands up. The orders echoed across the water, amplified by the sound of rotor wash from the Seahawk still circling above. The 2 suspects aboard the vessel complied without resistance. They dropped to their knees, hands visible, and remained still as boarding personnel climbed aboard. Using non-lethal restraint techniques, the suspects were zip-tied, pat-searched for weapons, and medically assessed for injuries. Finding none, the team transferred them to the RHIBs for secure transport back to the Sampson, where they were placed in the ship's temporary holding compartment under the custody of Ledet personnel. No weapons were found on either detainee or on deck. Once the suspects were secured and removed, the boarding team conducted a systematic sweep of the vessel. The interior revealed multiple indicators of narcotics trafficking, plastic insulation material, adhesive tape, and traces of white powdery residue on the deck and interior storage compartments. The stern was littered with fragments of discarded bale wrapping, some still partially intact, soaked in seawater. All observations were photographed and recorded per Coast Guard Evidentiary Protocol, and itemized into the official boarding report. These materials, though not full bales, still served as supporting physical evidence in potential prosecution. Critically, the vessel had no registration numbers, no national ensign, and no documentation aboard. It had ignored all VHF hails and refused to identify its country of origin. Under these conditions, and consistent with Article 110 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the vessel was confirmed to be stateless. With this confirmation, jurisdiction formally transferred from U.S. Navy operational control to U.S. Coast Guard Law Enforcement Authority under the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act, MDLEA. This transition, while administrative in form, was critical. It ensured that the forthcoming seizure, contraband recovery, and detainee processing would occur within the framework of U.S. federal law, preserving the legal integrity of the case, from sea to courtroom. The Go Fast was now secured. Its crew was in custody. Its interior bore physical evidence of trafficking, but floating all around it was even more damning, proof dozens of bales drifting in open water. The next phase would focus on recovery, identification, and the establishment of an unbroken chain of custody. As the disabled Go Fast vessel drifted in the quiet churn of the Eastern Pacific, the full extent of the smuggling operation revealed itself. Surrounding the boat, 47 bales of narcotics bobbed on the surface esquire, tightly bound and deliberately ejected in a last-minute effort to erase the evidence. But it was too late. The mission was already in motion, and the sea itself had become part of the crime scene. Guided by infrared imagery and aerial visual tracking from Reaper 1, the RHIB teams fanned out across the floating field of contraband. With practice coordination, sailors and Coast Guard personnel worked methodically, using grappling hooks, line-handling poles, and flotation aids to recover each bale before it could drift out of reach or sink beneath the surface. The rolling Pacific swells made the task physically demanding, but each retrieval was swift and deliberate. Once secured on deck, every bale was individually tagged and documented. Digital photos captured each package as it was recovered. GPS coordinates were recorded in real time to preserve a complete chain of custody, a critical step that would ensure all evidence remained admissible in future prosecution. On board the RHIBs, field testing began immediately. Using sterile procedures, Coast Guard personnel sliced into one of the bundles and extracted a small powder sample. The material was placed into a Scott reagent test kit, a fast-acting chemical test for cocaine hydrochloride. Within moments, the test strip turned a vivid bright blue, a clear and unmistakable confirmation of the substance's identity and purity. Laboratory analysis would later follow, but in the field, this test was definitive. And by the time the final bale was secured, the total recovered weight had reached approximately 439 pounds, roughly 560 kilograms. The wholesale value was estimated at $58 million, but depending on the destination, street distribution, and purity dilution, the potential street market value could easily have exceeded $150 million. Back aboard the USS Sampson, the bales were transferred with extreme care. Each one was moved into a climate-controlled evidence storage bay, a compartment designated for high-value contraband under maritime law enforcement protocols. Every transfer was witnessed, logged, and countersigned by both Navy crew and Coast Guard lead-ed officials, reinforcing a legal trail that would hold up under the scrutiny of any federal courtroom. This wasn't just a visual victory. It was a prosecutable one. Each kilogram recovered, each step documented, and each law follow turned a tactical seizure into a bulletproof case. With the suspects in custody and the cocaine recovered, the team turned back to the vessel itself. A final inspection confirmed what earlier assessments had already made clear: the boat was beyond salvage. Both outboard engines were destroyed. The fiberglass hull, stressed by evasive maneuvers and damaged by disabling fire, showed visible cracking near the keel. No bilge pump, no communications gear, no anchor, and no flotation equipment remained on board. Adrift and unpowered, the Go Fast was now a hazard zone that could endanger other ships in the region if left afloat. Under the authority of the Coast Guard's embedded law enforcement detachment, a decision was made to sink the vessel in a controlled manner. At 945 hours, a Sampson RHIB team deployed with a low-yield demolition charge. The device wasn't designed for dramatic effect, it was built for precision. Carefully affixed to the stern, it would breach the hull just enough to let seawater in, allowing the boat to sink without scattering debris or causing environmental harm. At 1,012 hours, with the Seahawk maintaining overwatch and all safety checks complete, detonation was authorized. A muffled pop marked the hull breach. Within 3 minutes, the vessel listed, dipped stern first, and vanished beneath the surface. A follow-up environmental sweep revealed no fuel leak, no floating debris, and no trace of the boat above the waterline. It was gone, eliminated safely, lawfully, and completely. From the opening moments of contact to the final stages of detention, the entire operation was conducted within a strict framework of legal oversight and procedural discipline. Under Title 14 of the United States Code, the U.S. Coast Guard is the primary maritime law enforcement authority in international waters. And when a vessel is determined to be stateless lacking a flag, identification, or national claim, Coast Guard jurisdiction extends fully and without dispute. That authority was present on board the USS Sampson in the form of Ledet 104, a specialized law enforcement detachment embedded under the Pacific Watch Initiative. Their role was not just operational, but legal. Every phase of the mission, from initial contact and hailing to the warning shots, boarding, arrest, and contraband seizure, was conducted under their command and oversight. Their presence ensured that each enforcement decision was fully compliant with both U.S. law and international maritime protocols. Equally important was the preservation of evidence. As the interdiction unfolded, every data point was captured and secured in real time. The ship's radar logs, forward-looking infrared FLIR, feeds, GPS coordinates, aerial surveillance, and weapons telemetry were all archived to meet prosecutorial standards. This data, encrypted and timestamped, was transmitted to Coast Guard District 11 in Alameda and the Joint Interagency Task Force South, JIATF South, in Key West 2, command nodes responsible for coordinating maritime law enforcement and integrating intelligence from across the region. That evidence doesn't just support a single case. It becomes part of a larger intelligence mosaic, helping analysts trace smuggling routes, identify emerging DTO patterns, and map cartel logistics across hemispheres. Back aboard the Sampson, the two detainees were held under federal maritime arrest procedures. Though they were detained on a Navy warship, their status was governed entirely by Coast Guard law enforcement authority. They were not prisoners of war. They were criminal suspects, to be processed through the U.S. justice system, transported, charged, and prosecuted according to federal narcotics statutes. In many ways, this operation was a textbook example of civil-military coordination at sea. The Navy provided the reach, the sensors, and the speed. The Coast Guard delivered the authority, the legality, and the chain of evidence. Together, they didn't just stop a smuggling attempt, they built a case that would hold up in court. The July 10, 2025 operation wasn't just a routine drug interdiction, it was a demonstration of how the United States projects power and legal authority far beyond its own coastline. It was a mission that blended tactical precision with judicial legitimacy. And it succeeded without a single casualty, without a single shot fired in hostility. In just a matter of hours, over 1.5 metric tons of high-purity cocaine were recovered from open water. A stateless vessel, fully engaged in narcotics trafficking, was lawfully identified, disabled, boarded, and removed as a threat, all in accordance with international law and U.S. code. The suspects were detained without resistance. The evidence was secured and documented. And the ocean, where this vessel once operated freely, was made just a little safer. But the impact of this operation doesn't end at the waterline. Every successful offshore interdiction sends ripples through the logistical networks of transnational drug trafficking organizations. The farther from shore these seizures happen, the more uncertain the trade becomes. Risk increases, timelines stretch, routes must be reconsidered, and profits, the currency of the cartels, begin to erode. This is deterrence by presence, deterrence by unpredictability, deterrence by law. What made this particular case stand out wasn't just the quantity of drugs recovered, it was how it happened. The USS Sampson, a ship engineered for missile defense and blue water combat, seamlessly adapted to serve as a forward-deployed law enforcement asset. From tracking and targeting, to aviation launch and recovery, to supporting Coast Guard-led arrests, the destroyer functioned as a hybrid warship police vessel, flexible enough to counter non-traditional threats without compromising its core readiness. This is the new model of maritime drug interdiction, Navy mobility and surveillance, working hand-in-hand with Coast Guard jurisdiction and arrest authority. It's a layered, adaptive response to a threat that no longer respects borders or convention. As cartels continue to evolve, using faster boats, longer routes, and more sophisticated tactics, the U.S. is evolving to deploying destroyers not just to deter nations, but to disrupt criminal empires operating in the vast, ungoverned spaces of the world's oceans. Because the sea may be open, but under Pacific watch, it is no longer uncontested.